Welcome to the Chi-Square Lab. Hopefully you're able to download our Markdown file from Canvas. The data set for this particular lab comes from a big survey that was done looking at religion. They surveyed data from all across the world, and they gathered information on what religion people followed and what that looked like. They did it twice, once in 2005 and once in 2012. In particular, the data set that we're looking at is going to focus specifically on atheism. So they've classified people into two different groups, whether they identified as an atheist or whether they identified as something other than an atheist, a non-atheist. And this kind of was brought about by a whole bunch of articles that sort of picked this up. Looking at whether or not atheism was on the rise in America in 2012. So that's where our data set's coming from. So hopefully you can run this code here. Again, as long as you're connected to the internet, it should be able to pick up this atheism data set. And if I click on it, we can check it out and just look at what's going on. So they have, each row represents an individual person. So in this data set, there is 88,032 people in this data set that were surveyed from all over the world. And we gathered information on their nationality, whether or not they identified as an atheist or a non-atheist, and then the year that the study was done. Okay, so this is the data set that we're going to be working with today. What you'll notice is that all three of these variables are categorical variables, right? So for response, there's only two outcomes, atheist or non-atheist. And for year, there's only two outcomes, 2012 or 2005. For nationality, there's lots of different nationalities there, I think. But in particular, for this first one, we're going to look specifically only at the United States. So I'm just going to put in a filter here. So our atheism data set, I'm just going to go through and subset this data set and only pull out the rows that had United States in them. So I'm just going to run this code. And so what you'll see is this creates a new data set called US. And if I click on that, we'll see it only contains rows where the nationality is United States. And so you see there's 2004 of those people that we recorded information about. Okay, so one thing that we might be interested in is getting some counts, right, of the number of people that fell into each category. I think that we talked about this table command a little bit when we talked about creating bar charts and things. So here's this table command. So if I run that, we can see here that the number that fall into the atheist and the non-atheist categories, right? So in 2005, out of the, let's see, 1,002 people they surveyed, they had 10 atheists and 992 non-atheists. And then in 2012, it looks like they surveyed 1,002. And they ended up with 50 and 952 accordingly. So we might be interested in asking whether the proportion of atheists has changed between 2005 and 2012. So this would be a chi-square test of homogeneity. I want you to note here that the row totals were fixed. So they asked 1,002 people in 2005 and 1,002 people in 2012, right? Those numbers were fixed. So any differences here between the numbers, they're not attributed to the fact that there was more or less people in 2005, just attributed to the fact that those are fixed. So again, this is a test of homogeneity, not a test of independent, because these row totals are fixed. It's also worth noting that if we're going to do a chi-square test, before we run a test, it's important that each of the boxes has at least 5 observations, and we definitely have at least 5 in each of those boxes. So we are good to go in running this chi-square test. So the test is chi-squared, sq.test, and then I plug in the table. So this is the same table that I used up here. Okay. And I've just used this correct is equal to false. This means that the results that we get will end up being the exact same as what we would do if we did it by hand. If you didn't include that, it would do a correction term, which is not wrong. It would be fine. It just won't match with what you got when you did it by hand. So if I run that, we can see here that we get, there's our test statistic, 27.49. It follows a chi-square distribution with 2 degrees of freedom. And it corresponds to this value. It's very small, so 1.579 times 10 to the minus 7, so 0.000000157.9. I think I've got the right number of zeros in there. So, you know, if the null hypothesis is that there is no difference in the proportions and the alternative is that there is a difference in the proportions, we're definitely getting a very small p-value. It wouldn't matter what level of confidence I picked, 95% or 99%, doesn't matter. We're definitely getting a really small p-value. We're rejecting that null hypothesis, and we can say that there's significant evidence for the alternative here. There's significant evidence to suggest that the proportion of atheists is different between 2005 and 2012. What we might be interested in particular is looking at what are those proportions, and is the proportion going up or is the proportion going down? So to get the actual proportions, I'm going to recommend that you use very similar code to before, but rather than chi-square.test, we're going to do prop.test. This stays the same, the table command and then the correction factor. And you can kind of ignore all of this stuff. This is something we might have covered in the regular class. You know, if you want to read through the textbook, you can learn more about it. You'll see here that this also gives a chi-square test and a p-value the same as it did before. But we're not going to talk about it entirely in detail, but it does spit out the 2 proportions. So this is the proportion of atheists in the first group, and this is the proportion of atheists in the second group. So the proportion of atheists in 2012 was about 5% or 4.9%, right? But in 2005, it was 0.9%. So the proportion of atheists is increasing or growing. A few things that I just want to point out here that I think it's important to get right. So here we know that this proportion is giving us the proportion of atheists because in our table, if I go back up here, atheist is the first column. So it's always going to give us the proportion in the first column divided by the total, right? So make sure that you keep that in mind if you're doing one of these tests, right? If we wanted to do the proportion of non-atheists, we would have to make sure that these 2 columns got flipped. Either that, or you just have to make sure that you remember that these proportions here are 1 minus, okay? But by default, this will always give you the proportion in the first column divided by the overall total. The other thing I will point out is that these proportions always, always, always go row-wise. So here, when I constructed my table, I did time here on this axis. So the rows were fixed, and it's going to do 10 divided by the 1002 and 50 divided by the 1002 to get the proportions. And make sure that the table is set up that way. If you had done this the other way around, if this had been response and year, for example, there's nothing wrong with that table. It looks just fine. And in fact, the chi-square test, if you run it on those flipped in the other order, it wouldn't change anything. You're going to get the same value for chi-squared. But when it goes through and works out the proportions, it's going to do it in the same way as it did before. So it always will do the first column divided by the row total. So we'd end up with the proportion of 2005s in the atheists and the proportion of 2005s in the non-atheists, which wouldn't make any sense here because the totals for the years are fixed. So all that to say is if you've got sort of a fixed values, right, make sure that it's being formatted this way. where your row totals are fixed, and know that the prop.test or proportion.test is always going to do the proportions row wise, right? So this row value in the first column divided by the row total for that first column. So just sort of something to keep in mind. So that test was all about looking at whether the proportion of atheists was the same or different, and we've got significant evidence here that the proportion has increased from about 0.9% to 5% in between those 2 years. So your challenge here is essentially to do a very similar analysis, except that I'm going to ask that you pick out some country that you're interested in. Let me just put it in here. So if I do US nationality, there's a whole bunch of different states there. Oops, sorry, it shouldn't be US nationality. It should be, of course, there's going to be none for those in the US one. It should be atheism. Atheism, nationality, look at them all. So not every country in the world is there, but there's lots of different choices. So you pick one that you think sounds interesting and filter out the data and do the analysis as it sort of suggests here in the problems. Best of luck. Don't hesitate to reach out and come see me in office hours or email me if you have any questions.